Hello there, it's Paul here and welcome along everyone. This is part 2 of my segmented clock series, and in the first part I spoke about the planning, buying the movement, making the rings, and to this extent. Part 2, what I'm going to do is literally all the lathe work, so it's gluing these up together and turning them all on the lathe and creating the plywood centre ring to do the pyrography on. Now there's many different ways you can deal with the segments, so this is just one way that I'm doing things at the moment. First of all, what I've done, I've created this for mounting all my segments on. This I've found does help improve things. This is just some softwood all glued together on a waste block, so it's quite easy to go back in the lathe every time. Now, depending on what you're doing segment wise, I mean, I've got two types here to show. One that I've glued up once before, and these are the ones I did in part 1. If you've got something like this, which is just a single ring and it's going to be for the clock, then as long as you've got a fairly reasonably flat surface, you could go ahead and put that straight on there. However, there's no reason why you can't treat this the same way as I'm going to do with these, just to get a nice surface to start with. As I said, there's many different ways you can do this. You can use a Longworth chuck to hold them in, face it off on the lathe, use a sanding board. You could basically put a sanding board down and just literally just go backwards and forwards with this. But what I've found is the easiest way for certainly getting these so that you can glue them all up in one go, or certainly quicker anyway, is to use a sanding disc. Now I've got a bench sander and it's only got a 6-inch disc on, so that's going to be no use whatsoever. Now a sanding disc is like this, very cheap to make. Sand all these down so they're nice and flat. Now these are all sanded down nicely, so that all should be totally flat surfaces and they'll all join together nicely. The next stage is basically gluing them to what you want to turn them on. But the other thing I've done on here as well, you'll notice I've got all these grooves, and that's just precisely for this, is that I can then line up where I want to put the actual ring to try and get it as central as possible. And I've just put the bolt in here because again it acts as a good thing to measure on. Now I just put these on with hot glue, and you don't need to go to the extent of literally, well again this is down to personal preference. I've found that I only need to really tack it on. I don't need to go and glue around the whole piece on the inside and also on the outside. What I'll usually do is I'll put a stretch across each of the side bits there, and I might tack a couple of these on the outside. What's against the base here is going to be the top, so we are working on the bottom first. So that's why I've got my Iroko ring first, and then I'll put my 2 mixed rings on the back afterwards. Now the glue gun is fully heated up. I will basically put some across the back here. Just let that cool a bit, because otherwise if I turn it over it will run. And then what I'll do, I will tack some of the edges. So that glue has totally gone off, and you can tell by its opaque colour that it's all nice and hard now, and you could effectively just put that on the lathe now and turn if you wanted to. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually, which is unusual normally with segmented work, normally you would put stuff at an angle like that to overlap the joints, but because of the pattern I want to create here, and I've created my angles at literally a 90-degree angle there and a 30-degree angle there, these, even though you put the same size pieces straight over each other, are going to totally overlap across the joins. All I'm using is ordinary wood PVA glue, and this stuff does stick really well. Just put plenty on. Plenty on. And I'll put on both surfaces. And I'm just going to put a board down in case it seeps over the edge, so just using the finger. And just like when you're gluing up the segments, put it on, rub it in, just so that the glue can bind. I'm just going to leave that now for probably about 10-15 minutes, maybe half an hour at the most, and that will be held well enough so that we can then get the final ring glued on. That's now been left about half hour, and as you can see the glue has totally gone off, so that is totally stuck. And just repeat the process again for the final ring. And once again I'll just clamp this down, and that will now be left for at least 24 hours before it goes onto the lathe. Now these have been glued up for quite some time now, as I've been getting on with other projects, so they should certainly be fully set. And we now have our 3 rings as required, all on this backing plate. So the first job that I will do, I want to put a taper on here so that the edges always sit out at the wall, and true up this inside. So for this I'm just going to use my new Ashley Isles 12mm spindle gouge. And if I put a straight edge up against that now, I can see I've actually got quite a taper on there, which is fine. So the next thing is to true up this inside, and just be careful because you are going to be cutting an awful lot of air. It's often easier to run the toolbar parallel with the way you want to cut. What you'll find it's actually easier when you're cutting this side, because of the build-up of all the cuttings come off there. It's actually easier to watch on this side. You can actually see precisely where you're going. Right, that's perfect. So that's got to be our size for what we've got to go to right on the inside. So what I need to do now is create a recess on the outside here. And you ideally want this square or tapered inwards from the outside. Certainly make sure it's not tapered the other way, because otherwise you won't be able to then slide your piece of plywood in. And there's various ways you can do this. I try different ways. I will try first of all an ordinary scraper. Depending on how that cuts, I might well go to a skew, working in the same way. Now the other thing to remember as well, don't go too far down to where you want the finished sides, because you will be taking the top surface off on the other side to true it all up. So there I've left myself probably about 9mm, so at least I can just take off a bit off the surface once it's been flipped around. So what I'm going to do next is just true up some of this surface. It's not going to be totally true, because when we flip this around on the other side, it's highly unlikely that this is going to be still fully round. So that is now about where we're going to be, and next job is just to sand this all up on the inside and on the bottom here, and I'll come back when that's done. That is now sanded to 400 all on the inside there and the bottom. I've sanded the edges smooth so that there's no sharp edges on it. Next job is to basically take this off the backing plate and reverse it around. And what I tend to do with the hot glue is just to use an ordinary chisel just to pick away at the hot glue. Just mind your fingers. And that's the ring off. And it's best to try and clear as much of this glue off as you can, because when you try and turn it off, it just all heats up and then sticks to your tools. Now I've got this lined up the best I can, and you're better off to glue this from inside now, because that's going to be the inside of the back, and at least any marks that you leave are not going to be visible. I'm just going to now re-true up this outside edge before I then work on the face and on the inside. The edge is now trued up on the outside. We were slightly off centre a bit, so there is a slight difference in wall thicknesses between the inside and the outside. I'm now going to do the front edge here and tidy up the rim. Right, that's much better. Now I know my hands have got about 180 odd mil reach, so I know that they're going to be well within this rim. If your hands are going to have to go over the rim, then you really need to make sure you worry about this thickness as well. But as it is, this is now done as much as I can, and it's just a case of sanding it all up. That's the ring now off, and I've used exactly the same method as before, just using a ordinary wood chisel just to prise the glue apart, and then I've just been round with a bit of sandpaper just to tidy this all up. Now by doing this manually, putting it on here, you can never be 100% accurate, but I think even if I haven't got a Longworth chuck, and I find this is a great method for doing this, but even by doing this, when I flip this obviously from that side over to this side, what I found was that I now have a perfect rim on the top here. I have a perfectly round piece on the outside, totally true, and by putting it on there, what I've found is that being manual about it is that I now have a wall thickness of about 1mm difference, which to me is quite acceptable, because that wall thickness is only noticeable on the inside. That side is about less than 1mm difference to the thickness of this side. so therefore our rim is slightly out inside as well. But I'm not bothered about that. Now, one of the main reasons I created this though was when I cut my piece of ply to go in there, to get it fully circular, I used to mount it on the lathe initially, but I found that you got loads of tear out. But by putting your piece of plywood on here, and what I used to do then was I drilled a piece of hole through the plywood for the size of the hole for the clock movement, and then basically inserted a bolt in there and held it down in place with this, and again tacked down the edges for where it was loose. Then you could use your parting tool to cut it out at the right size. I've since created myself a circle cutting jig for the bandsaw, so I'm hoping now that I can just take a measurement inside here and I will come up with the perfect circle. So I can see on here that needs to be about 218 mil, and it might need to be slightly smaller because I've got a slight taper in here. Now this is my circle cutting jig I have on the bandsaw, and the first thing to do is set the distance from the blade, as in the radius that you want the circle to be cut at. Lock that down in place. I have basically drilled a centre hole in there, which is slightly smaller than what this pin is. So when I can locate it, it will go on quite tight. Feed this in first of all before we then start cutting the circles. Now the good thing about using the jig is that even though we've got a little bit of tear out we've got to tidy up there with a bit of sandpaper, it's a lot better than the finish I get on the lathe. And what I can do now is I can actually test that, and I can see that I'm not fitting. So whereas when I do this on the lathe I can't do that because it's glued on the piece of wood. So I can now remount that back on here, and I can take this in slightly. And then retest it. And there I have a nice snug fitting piece. Now that's part two finished with. It's where I've basically covered the process of using this as a backing plate for turning the actual final ring, and where I used to use it also for cutting that piece of ply on. Now there is absolute minimal tear out on there using the circle cutting jig, and it's also a first time as well that I have a very snug fit with very little movement in there. If you've not seen the first part of me making the segmented ring and the planning of the clock, please do go back. There will hopefully be a link somewhere in the corner here, and certainly below in the description, on how I do that, because really the planning part is so important to getting to this point. In the third and final part I will go over how I choose my images, what I'm looking for, and do the actual pyrography work and the final assembly. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.